Most analysts are assholes because they try to make everything about the topic that they know about, even especially if it's not. And if the client knows something about that region or topic, holy crap, all hell breaks loose. They kind of gravitated to me because I was the only person who considered disagreement with the client as an opportunity to learn as opposed to an opportunity to pick a fight. And then when I left, discovered that a lot of the clients were willing to follow me, which was not the plan. I didn't plan on leaving. It was, messy situation. Anyway, so every time I speak with a client, I have to learn the world from their point of view. And you do that a few hundred times, and all of a sudden you've got a pretty good map of how everything fits together. And so I've got a staff that helps me keep up on all current events and who helps me decipher the connections between the client's world and everything else, and that's how we do what we do. It's a twin story of demographics and geography. So in the world before 1945, if you had iron ore and coal and oil and food, you could industrialize and make something of yourself. And if you failed to have all four of those things, then you were probably a colony because they would be industrialized, you would not, and they would be bringing guns to knife fights, and that is the entirety of the story of the British Empire. In 1945, things changed because the Americans found themselves in a world they didn't recognize. We were in Europe at the end of the war, and we saw Stalinist Russia, and we didn't like it. We're like, holy crap, we do not want to go up against that by ourselves. So we needed bodies, lots and lots of bodies, to stand up and stand between us and the Soviets. No one wanted to do that because World War II sucked for everybody in Europe. So we basically had to come up with an inducement. And the solution was free trade and globalization. Access to the American market, access to global resources. Because it used to be that if you were industrialized and you had a navy, then you could control the flow to this or that mineral or energy source or food source. And if you didn't, you were probably a pre-industrialized subsistence agriculture environment. And that was no fun at all. But now everyone didn't need those four things. They only needed one of them, and they could trade for the rest. And so we all started to develop, and that meant we all started to move into cities. And when you move into cities, kids go from being a free resource and free labor to a really, really expensive conversation piece. And we had fewer of them. And so the population structure started to age in a way it hadn't before. So if you think of a pre-industrial population like a pyramid, lots of children at the bottom, few retirees at the top, it started to open up into a chimney. Child mortality wasn't as bad, people would live longer. And we had this nice period in the advanced world from roughly 1950 to roughly 2000. When instead of having a pyramid, we had a column. Not too many children relative to the total, not too many retirees relative to the total, but a lot of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s who would consume, 40s, 50s, and 60s who would produce. And it was the fastest economic growth the world has ever seen. In 1990, globalization was kind of thrown open to everybody, and everyone else joined in, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Russians, and everything. And they went down that path a lot faster than we had. And so the transformation that we did in 2 or 3 generations, they did in 1 and 2. Well, we're now on the other side of that. After decades of rapid aging, we're not just running out of children. That was 20 to 40 years ago. We're now running out of working age adults. At the same time that the Americans, 30 years on from the Cold War, have really lost interest in maintaining the global system. So we're losing the strategic rationale for globalization. At the same time, the economic rationale is dissolving because if you don't have enough young people to consume, there's no point in trading in the first place. So this was always the decade where it was all going to break down. It was just a question of the specifics of the order and just how fast it could happen. And what we're seeing with the degradation of the Chinese system in the Ukraine war is it can happen pretty fast. Sure, so everybody started the industrialization process at their own pace and at their own time and from different starting points. And as a rule, if you have a lot more elbow room, a lot more small towns and arable farmland, the transition was slower because the economic need to move from the urban or into the urban environments the pressure wasn't as great. And so in places with a lot of space where the weather is broadly positive, like the United States, that process has been really slow. In fact, while industrialization really got going after 1945, technically the US started the process back in the 18th century. So for us, this has been a 7-8 generation process, and it's been relatively gentle. But the Germans became majority urbanized as early as 1900. And then in the post-World War II environment, when they could import food so they didn't have to eat their own crappy food, everyone moved into the cities. And it's by far the most urban environment outside of places like Singapore. So there it's much faster. The Chinese didn't start really until the 70s.
Right.
And so you've got the least productive farmland in the world with the most input intensive, with rice farming, which gives you the highest rate of fatalities just from the process of doing it. Everyone got out of the rice paddies as soon as they could. And now they all live in high rises. And so there they went from having 6 and 7 kids to less than 1 in a single generation. So the top of the list in terms of losers is by far China. We now know that the Chinese demographic situation is so poor that maintaining a national constitution is not possible past this decade. And so we're looking at a complete disintegration of that system in the short period. Korea is probably number 2, very, very rapidly aging. Started in the 50s, but so fast. Germany and Italy are probably 3 and 4 for similar reasons. But on the other side, you've got countries like the United States who've got a lot of elbow room, who have managed to keep their birth rates high. Sweden is on that list. France is on that list. Argentina is on that list. And then there's some countries in the middle where the